We are joined by Dan Bouk, who has joined us to talk about Michigan State basketball. Draymond Green, the Golden State Warriors getting off $130 million or so by trading James Wiseman for 172 second-round picks, and various players who will not crack the rotation, and James Wiseman not going to my beloved Portland Trailblazers. James Wiseman would have been a source of false hope for me and my team, which is what fuels me and my team, is false hope. All I look for at the trade deadline is false hope. And this trade deadline, we did not get enough to produce even the falsest of hope. We end up acquiring Cam Reddish, which might not be all that goodish. Matisse Thybulle, I will not use his last name for any punnery. And it's not great. It's not great. I'm rooting for him. But none of those players is taller than 6'9". None of those players can guard. I went to the Bucks game, and I root for the Blazers through thick and thin, and I think the players on their team are wonderful humans, and I'm on their side. And when we were playing against the Milwaukee Bucks, it appeared at times that we had forgotten to field a team. I don't mean to say that it appeared that they were dominating us. I mean to say it appeared at many junctures we were absent, that our team had remembered to bring fans. I was in the stands as one of them, that we remembered to have bobbleheads and concessions. There were referees and another team, but we, it appeared, may have at times forgotten to field a team. And Brook Lopez.
The positive thing about that, Jefferson, though, is that if you don't field a team, you can't get in foul trouble.
We managed nonetheless. We managed from the sidelines to get in foul trouble. And Brook Lopez managed to look like Wilt Chamberlain against us. Okay. It was just, and I'm like, God bless our 6'7" thin setters who would dominate the Patriot League. And speaking of the Patriot League, from Colgate University comes Dan Bouk. Dan Bouk is the author of Democracy's Data. I've got it right here. The Hidden Stories in the U.S. Census, and how to read them. His first book was How Our Days Became Numbered. It looked into the spread into everyday Americans' lives, the insurance industry's methods for quantifying people with impact on race, inequality, statistics. Dan, or Professor Bouk, looks at the history of things cloaked in boringness, bureaucracies, quantifications, numerosities. He now joins Democracy Nerd to discuss his book, Democracy's Data, a look into the 1940 U.S. Census. And it's a New York Times notable book for 2022. Dan Bouk, thank you so much. The website is shroudedInCloaksOfBoringness.com. I love it. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. This was a really exciting opening to this event. I've got to say, I think it's important that this is being recorded as well, so that James Wiseman somewhere can listen to this and find out and just hear how sad you were that James Wiseman was not included in this trade. He's got to know the amount of feeling that was there.
I'm a top 100 James Wiseman fan. Okay, I have watched every minute of recorded James Wiseman playing time, summer league, college, and pro. I have watched. Unfortunately, there isn't enough of it. Okay. Unfortunately, his highlight reel is thin. I do not believe that's capability. I believe it's opportunity. He needs iterations to hone his skill set. And I'm on James Wiseman's side. Ah, dear Lord. That's not really what we came to talk about. It's just that we're recording this on trade deadline day. You should at least say something about basketball to make me feel mildly comfortable that I haven't totally violated any expected norms of hospitality and conversation. Do you have any notes to offer on your beloved Michigan State or Colgate, or if you still are, or you're now a Warriors fan, any thoughts you have at all?
Yeah, my primary allegiance is now good days to the Warriors, and that's because I followed Draymond Green from Michigan State to the Warriors, and they turned out to be a pretty good team. And I gotta admit, Draymond Green has his rough edges, we'll say. But one of the things that I like about a basketball player are the basketball players who primarily do things by boxing people out get in people's way. I'm kind of a fan of the boring parts of the game, which is also something that happens in my scholarship. I mean, I love that feeling of a 3 that Steph launches from place that no human. I mean, I guess Dame does this too, but no human ought to put a ball in from that depth. And there's a thrill, there's an excitement to that, but just that.
But the weak side box out is what you're looking
it's
for. The guarding the passing lane that prevents the pass, not just that creates the steal. Right. This is the kind of thing you're looking for.
But just shutting it all down. Yeah, no, I mean, there's like, I'm not even smart enough to see it, but I can recognize its influence and its effect, and it's glorious.
I'm getting better at not just ball following, and in fact, Draymond Green helped me. So I went to the Warriors game last night, and my beloved Portland Trailblazers did defeat the Warriors, who are hard to root against, but Draymond Green makes it easier for me to root against. And not because I don't enjoy his personality, it's just because that personality is not on my team. Okay, it's on another team, and that makes it more of a problem.
Right.
And I did watch him guard most of our team on a single play, right? He went over there, so nothing happened. And then he went over there, so nothing happened. And then he went over there and blocked the shot. And I was okay, so we don't get to score because I thought we had 5 guys, but they have that one guy, so we're not going to score this time. And so I'm getting better at not ball following. I admire your admiration of the boringness. How did it get going? How did you start caring about the things that not everybody was paying attention to? Not only distracted by the laser beams of grandeur, but by the fundament of the ground and the dirt and the things that make the grandeur possible.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I'll try to be perfectly honest, because we've already really laid bare our souls in this podcast. And a significant part about it is complete and total cowardice, right? Like writing about things that people care about is terrifying. Whereas if you start with something that no one believes that they should care about in the first place, there's a lot of like room and space to get them to be invested in things. And one of a question, like an interesting thing to think about, is why there's so many really important things in a modern society that seem so incredibly boring, like you don't really care about them. And you know, it's a real question for me. Like, it could be in a complicated system. We've got like all these different moving parts. We have hundreds of millions of people trying to do sorts of things. You're trying to organize them. Maybe it's just that we're so overwhelmed by the complexity that you just shut down and you say, never mind, this is too boring, I'm not going to pay attention. Maybe, though, some of these systems that are allocating power, allocating resources, maybe the people who run those systems, the institutions that kind of organize them, have a certain interest in making them complicated, making them difficult, making it hard to access them. Do you need a jargon, a language? And in that case, that boringness, it was maybe more instrumental. And I don't think it's one or the other. I think both of those play a role.
So I heard 2 things that, in fact, so I have now been playing with the notion that boring doesn't exist, or rather that we misunderstand its definition, or at least its root. And I'm reminded of my grandmother, who I would be sitting around. She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm bored." And she'd be incredulous. She said, "How could you possibly be bored? Literally the entire world is somewhere within your reach. It's like right outside there. Like literally, there's so many things to do." And eventually that internalized, right? And now I'm never bored. Sometimes I am at rest, but I'm never bored. But the other thing occurred to me is that maybe nothing is boring. That in fact, I think about when I first dawned on me that maybe nothing is boring was how I became a NASCAR fan. Now I'm not a rabid NASCAR fan, but there was a time I was a somewhat rabid NASCAR fan. It was because my step uncle, my stepbrother's uncle, stepmom's brother, got a job in the pit crew for the Penske race team. And so when the PIR was hosting a big race, I went to, and that was not a NASCAR race. That was an open wheel race. Okay. But, and hosted as IndyCar style. And I went to the race, and I learned about all this stuff. I learned about what had to happen in the pit crew. I learned how important tires were. I learned how important the speed of changing tires were. I learned the device you use to make the tires faster. I learned why one driver's, I learned all stuff that I hadn't paid attention to before. And I realized, maybe using your language, maybe what I was bored about before was not understanding the complexity. Once I understood those pieces, which weren't beyond my capacity, weren't beyond the capacity of all the people who had probably been sort of ritually, intellectually belittled by any number of people at Colgate, okay, but that knew, sorry, in your ivory Colgate tower, as bright as crest strips, that I knew, that I knew then all of a sudden it was interesting. And it occurred to me, maybe stuff, even our primary analogy of what is boring, which is watching the grass grow. Heck, grass growing is fascinating. Like, what could be more interesting than the sun turning into something that creates things that I might be able to eat, that something is eaten that I might eat? It's fascinating. What do you have favorite examples of stuff that other people find boring? We're going to talk about the census. Do you have other favorite examples of things that other people find boring that you said, no, it ain't boring? They're either missing the some of the elements, the complexity they could figure out, or in fact, the drama, the people that are trying. The other thing I heard you say, the people are trying to keep it complex, to put the wool over your eyes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll admit this is a place where I believe this to be really exciting, but I'm even myself right now in the process of figuring out how to make it exciting. So I'm right now thinking about budgeting. I lived through, as many of us did, the budget crises that came about with the COVID pandemic, and then along with that, all the budget politics that came around, the defund NYPD movement in New York City, where I live. And it got me thinking about the way in which the like a budgeting process, I mean, makes grass grow and look exciting. And yet, when you start to talk to people about, like, so for instance, how the New York City budget works, one thing you hear now, I've heard now repeatedly, is that there's like maybe 5 people who know how this process works in the world, which for a city of 7 or 8 million
How many people?
right,
How many people understand how the process works?
like 5.
Wow. And they're in the budgeting office. Is any of them like the majority leader or the head of the Ways and Means Committee? Like, who are these 5?
I mean, so I you're gonna make me like try to enumerate them all.
No,
My guess
not all,
is,
but just
yeah,
any peak, any insight,
yeah.
even one example.
There's like the mayor's office will have their like key budget person, and who's going to like help to orchestrate this whole scenario. And then the city council is going to have its budget committee. And again, there might be the chair that might know it, but really it's like the key lawyer in that committee is going to be the person who really knows how it is that works. There's a kind of essentially like an office of management and budget that exists for the city, and there's somebody in there who knows how it works. There's also this, I think, really interesting organization called the Independent Budget Office, which I don't know nearly enough about, but that was invented in part as a kind of counterweight to try to push back against the fact that there are these competing forces already in the government. And so there's somebody in the Independent Budget Office who theoretically knows about this. And then there's probably like one other lawyer who's floating around between these committees who also really understands how this works. And they have to know both how like New York City's budgeting process works, but also because of the way in which like state law controls so much of the money that flows through, they also have to really understand what's happening in Albany and the kind of federal stuff. But it's if you any particular moment of it, it's like, oh, this is just really complicated. But as you start to then, for your analogy with grass growing, watching grass grow is actually kind of boring. But if you watch in a different way, if you say, all right, I'm going to check out a patch of grass, I'm going to come back to it for 5 minutes every day, see what happens, what's living in there, see if we treat it with different fertilizers, what happens if I like stomp on it, right? You can then over time create a mode of observation, which turns this into, like you say, something pretty interesting. So the question here is like, how can we look at something like budgeting and realize that there's going to be these particular moments, like when a budget first rolls out and there are these, the city council has an opportunity to call in all of these department heads. Now they're like the Department of Sanitation, right? Sends in their chief. The interesting thing here is they're working for the mayor, this is the mayor's budget. So they're supposed to be kind of like, I love it. This is great. And the city council is in there just trying to find ways to get them to admit that there's something wrong and that they need more money or that there's a misallocation in here. And so these poor, I don't know, yeah, these poor civil servants sitting here in the middle as like the mayor's watching being like, are you towing the party line properly? And the city council's there like, aren't you sure that you wouldn't like an extra couple $1 million for your workers in here? And like, that's actually, there's a lot of drama there, but who would know to look at it? And you have to like figure that out to then be able to like properly stage it, tell the story.
And budgeting process is fascinating. And I admire your work because helping people understand, right, either the drama or the elements, right, how to make the boring interesting, because very often it can be the cover for something either important or enjoyable, or both. I like you using New York City budget as an example, or at least I want to say something about it. That I remember as a kid growing up in a smaller town than New York City, as most people grow up in towns smaller than New York City. People would focus on New York City budget, like, well, okay, that's just a city, or focus on New York City politics. You know, the mayor of New York would appear on Saturday Night Live. I know he's local, but I think New York City is the third biggest government in the United States. I think the biggest government is the U.S. federal government. I think the second biggest government is the state of California. And I think the third biggest government is New York City. I think New York City's budget is bigger than New York State, I think. And I think the difference is between California and New York, for instance, or like LA and New York, is that California state government runs its schools. New York City runs its schools. So I think that's why that budget disparity, but I think it's no worse than fourth. But all right, let's keep going. How'd you start getting into the census? How'd you start realizing, you know what, the 1940 census, we've got to understand this?
So I had an instinct about the 1940 census. Since I wrote this book, like I've run into economists and they'll say to me, oh yeah, 1940, that makes total sense. I'm like, yeah, why? And they're like, well, because that's the census where you get totally the best economic data. Like this is the one where in the manuscript census records, we have the most amount of information. And I see where they're coming from. One of the reasons for that is that in 1940, for the first time, the federal government in the census asked questions about people's individual income. This turns out to be a very controversial question, in part because this is 1940, so it's a presidential election year. The Republicans in the Senate realize that they can use this as an issue to try to kind of hit at FDR's policies. So they say, look, FDR is running out the census, wants to know about your income because he wants to, get into your personal finances, use that then to tax you, do all kinds of other sorts of things. And they're largely attacking the FDR's general kind of growth of a welfare state. Yeah. And indeed, that was one of the things that really was interesting for me about the 1940 census was you can see the census questions change, what the government looks for changes as you can see reflected what the policy machine is trying to process, the questions that it's asking. So up to that period earlier in the 20th century, a lot of the real estate on a census form is devoted to questions about where a person came from, what language they spoke, where their parents came from, what language those spoke. You can see the way in which Congress and the American people were desperately arguing about immigration policy. And then after 1924, which very severely restricts immigration to the United States, those questions are kind of shifted off. And instead we have the Depression, and then the census sheet transforms to be much more concerned with and devoted to questions about, are people moving? Where are they moving in the United States? Are they employed? How many are unemployed? What kind of money are they making? And that both is about then what's the state of them, but also what possibilities are there for government, for big business, for big labor to use this information to build a different kind of government.
So once government gets in the business of trying to solve problems economically, right after cataclysmic economic challenge that it was not solved by an invisible or free hand, and then all of a sudden figuring out how to deploy those resources. And that, of course, people say it every 10 years when it's time to do the census. Remember, the census matters because that's how resources are getting developed. When they were deciding how that was going to work, not exactly the first place, but in the case of some federal agencies, the first place, figuring that out around 1940 became really important.
Yeah, no, and it's not just, I like the way you put it, that it's the government becoming involved in fixing economic problems. And that might feel like that's what governments have always been doing. And actually, that's a relatively recent invention, this idea that the government has a responsibility to try to manage the larger economy. That, and along with that, that the government might have a responsibility to guarantee a certain level of economic security for individuals. That's explicitly a Rooseveltian invention, the Committee on Economic Security, which produces Social Security and the sort of thing. That idea of economic security, that's all born in the 1930s out of the Depression. And so, yeah, the census then is a means by which to start trying to get that policy apparatus to continue, but it also becomes then a flashpoint around which the foes of these changes can mobilize protest against those policies.
You know, and we haven't really gotten into it enough probably in these discussions, but yeah, go back blank number of hundreds of years. And, you know, the purpose of government was for the king to have stuff, get stuff, and then like, kill people who try to take their stuff and get people together to fight those wars. That was the primary deal, right? You organize your fiefdoms so that you could defend your territory or wage war to take somebody else's was much of the gig. All right, so you start digging into the 1940 census, and I'm stealing this from Kyle, our producer. Said, you know, do you have that? Was there that room in your grandparents' house? It was full of old boxes. You looked inside. It had old clippings and mementos that helped shape a story. And is there a chance to sort of lift that collective lid from those boxes to piece together the story of the United States? When you started getting into it, what was that treasure trove of information? Where were you looking in order to kind of inform this, and anything there that surprised you most?
Yeah, that's a fun metaphor. And this is also a little bit of the answer to that question about why 1940. When I began the study, which about 5 years ago, the most recently released full trove of census information came from 1940. So that means not just me, but basically anybody who does their own family genealogy, anybody who's trying to do local history, they almost always start with the most recent census. So the Census Bureau is very committed to individual privacy. And so any response that you give to the census is held completely confidential for 72 years. At least it's supposed to. As we can talk about for 1940, one of the other things about 1940 is that those restrictions were relaxed and were used against Japanese Americans during World War II. But since then, the United States has been particularly, and the Census Bureau has been particularly adept at trying to maintain that confidence. So as a result, we don't get to see individual responses. We see the numbers that are produced at the end of the census, but we don't see what every person says until 72 years later. So I went to the National Archives a lot. I spent a lot of time looking through the records of the Census Bureau itself. But fundamentally, the most important resource for me was these 131 million people that were written down on a whole bunch of sheets of paper and that have all now been digitized and we can access, and you can kind of pick through and look for what's happening. So like any person can do this. The one thing that I guess if we're thinking about like how can other people try to like do the same kind of work, and how is it that I see these records maybe a little bit differently than other people do? When I see a census record, which is 40 people long, their names, all these answers to these questions across the side of the form. Think of a form about the size of a newspaper, half a newspaper. I always look right to the top right-hand corner where you see the name, the signature of the enumerator, because every single person in the census had another person come and find them. I mean, it's kind of audacious. It's crazy to imagine we're going to take 120,000 people in a couple months, send them everywhere across the entire United States, and they're going to like touch every single person and put them down on a piece of paper. And then when you
crazy, right? It's really actually kind of impressive.
It's incredibly impressive. So census people, and this is all over the records, they always talk about it using essentially military metaphors. There's just no way to understand the scale of the mobilization except as like an army of enumerators, because that's the only other time when so many people all at once move in a coordinated fashion. But this coordinated like pincer movement is to like find and enumerate every single person so that they can be represented ideally, right? When it really works, it's just so they can be properly represented and like fit into this democracy.
The enumerators is not quite maybe as it's not like the regulators, right? But it's still, I'm telling you, there's something like, you know, Charlie Sheen should be in some movie with the enumerators, right? Emilio Estevez. I'm just thinking, you know, maybe we pick a new generation. Maybe Ashton Kutcher. We could, and why does it have to be dudes? I don't know. We can go with anybody.
Yeah. No,
so
I mean, in fact, about half of the enumerators were women in 1940.
I was going to ask, what were were there biases? Like once you have 120,000, not only do military metaphors to help understand that mobilization, because there aren't that many vocabularies, not many lexicons or sort of strategic tomes from which to draw from that could help you figure out how you move 6 figures worth of people. But also in terms of discipline, that you want to make sure enumerators are doing kind of the same stuff, kind of count the right way, and not just filling out their forms at the end saying, I talked to 6 people, but when they actually just took lunch. Were there biases that anybody was particularly worried about that or things that you particular errors that they watched for, or they maybe speculated about afterwards?
Yeah. The world of the census, again, when you find things that become more interesting the more you dig into them, they have this whole like vocabulary for concerns about census fraud, like an entirely different set of words that they use to think about this. There also is like a fairly well-developed amount of census-related poetry, which I discovered as I was doing this. Like a lot of people have written poems about census, both like famous people, ordinary citizens tend to like write and compose poetry and then send it to government officials. Apparently this is a thing. But in that specialized vocabulary about fraud, one of the best terms is curbstoning. So the way in which people talk about the fear that an enumerator will, instead of knocking on a whole bunch of doors, sit on the curb and just write out a whole bunch of names, is this idea of curbstoning. That's like, oh, we have to make sure that whatever happens, these enumerators don't go off curbstoning. And they
so
do
curbstoning, the threat there, I was thinking they start writing things down so people come outside and that's what you're doing. No, you mean they sit on the curb to start making stuff up. You mean
making stuff up.
Yeah. So we used to canvass, we used to go door to door, and you know, I always wanted to make sure that somebody actually did their thing, went door to door, filled out their thing, didn't just say, oh, I talked to these voters and then went to McDonald's.
So, I mean, there are a number of mechanisms that they use to try to limit the amount of curbstoning. We should say also there are a couple of really high-profile curbstoning incidents. They were often coordinated curbstoning incidents in which especially like town boosters would work with a bunch of enumerators and encourage them. The enumerators were paid by the head, so they had a certain economic incentive to do this. But at the same time, most of the time, these enumerators are being employed through kind of political, they've been chosen or selected by people who are chosen or selected by the dominant congressional party's representatives. And so there's a certain, and they are all interested primarily in actually getting a pretty accurate count, because that accurate count is going to help them keep their seats. And there's a fair amount of general interest in not making this kind of turn out badly. And so we have very few instances in which we find people actually curbstoning. But then the Census Bureau, in terms of trying to like limit this, they start to create a more elaborate structure in which they have these squad leaders who will be people who are wandering around and checking on people's records to make sure that it looks like what they're doing is accurate. They have from
like
1880
spot
on.
Checks.
Yeah, spot checks.
Spot checks to avoid curbstoning and hopefully not curb it by curb stomping.
Yeah, no, it does. It sounds like some kind of
sounds like American
condition.
History X. It sounds like something really horrible, but it is something just kind of bad. And so you got spot checkers, which we called, what you said, what were they? They weren't, and those weren't the enumerators. Those were
squad leaders.
Squad leaders. This is it's so much more exciting when we give them the names. Keep going.
So another thing that the Census Bureau did is from 1880 on, they required that not only would you put a person's name, but you'd also put then their relationship to the head of household. So essentially, that one of the things about the census, which has always been true, but we often forget, is that it's not really a census of individuals, it's a census of households. In order to be counted, you have to first be in a household. And once you're in a household, then you can be counted as an individual. And then the theory was, and I see this play out with Census Bureau folks talking about things, was that they require an enumerator to not just name people, but then explain how they fit in a family, that they don't trust that enumerators are good enough at making up people and relationships that they could do it in a way that wouldn't make it clear that they were making stuff up. So essentially, by just asking this question about relationship, they view that as a kind of de facto check or means that they can better get a sense of whether it looks like an enumerator is doing something funny. Now, the kind of implications for that, if we're thinking about like a very diverse community, is that they in the Bureau are imagining a certain kind of household. They're imagining a pretty prototypical man, woman, children household. And when households start to look a little bit different, they're going to be subject to more scrutiny. For my purposes, the 1940 census, one of the really interesting things that got me going was I had a friend sent me a file, and she said, I found these people, and one of them is listed as a partner to the other person. These are two women living together. She's like, what's up with that? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't know what's up with that. And we started looking, and it turns out they're all over the place. And sometimes we know from other evidence that in fact what we are finding are gay and lesbian lovers who have been living together. We know from other circumstances, but in general, what we're usually finding, I call these essentially queer communities, people living on margins. Sometimes it's because they're in gay relationships, but sometimes it's just that they're living outside of this existing like norm of what a household looks like. Find lots of partners, for instance. One of the heaviest, most densest place to find partners is in Hawaii.
Interesting.
And that's because in Hawaii, which is still a colony at this point, right? Still part of the empire, not a state yet. Lots of people who are living in plantation work camps are essentially living a whole bunch of adults together. One of them gets named the head, and all the rest get named partners. So this is a household. It's just a household that no one in Washington, D.C. was thinking about when they created the census. And so then we end up having like all these different people who they just create this category partner to try to figure out how to fit people in. Like this is for me, like when it comes to like just me as an individual, the questions that most get me is that I wonder, how is it do we take messy reality and somehow try to fit it into what the form will allow? And in doing that, kind of define how it's acceptable to be a person.
Because prior to, and I'm looking actually, this page 70 says before the 1850 census, only the heads of households, male by default, were named in the survey. The rest of the household simply became a set of tally marks or numbers attached to the name. So somehow before 1850 and then 1940 and then today, in fact, that's in your partners chapter, your whole chapter of partners, because it turns out that, for instance, gay relationships weren't invented when the census started acknowledging they weren't invented. It when more people, they weren't invented with Harvey Milk, right? They invented well before that. And how did they even start identifying the nomenclature, particularly if they're out enumerating, right? And squad leaders are monitoring the enumerators to spot check potential curbstoning. So this might be the title of the episode. Squad leaders monitor the enumerators to spot check potential curbstoners. This is something you only know if you listen to this show and read Democracy's Data by Dan Bouk. That how do they even start coming up with a nomenclature when what they're doing is actually investigating to some degree how people are actually living? Like, do they do that all ex ante, do all that before they send out the enumerators, or the enumerators coming back and saying, hey, listen, folks, we got to come up with categories to describe what's actually happening out there?
So one thing to remember is that they're doing this on paper. And one of the magical things about paper is you can just write whatever you want. So unlike you send something out with an iPhone and an app, and it's got like a pull down menu. So sure, quite frequently, people would be sent out and they'd have a piece of paper and it would have on the bottom all of the acceptable categories. But then the enumerators don't always pay attention to what those acceptable categories are. So the partner, for instance, isn't listed. It shows up in a few of the kinds of instructions, but it's not a privileged category. The Bureau doesn't really want you to use partner. And indeed, once you send back all of those sheets that have partners, a person who's responsible for then like punching those all onto paper cards that are going to be used for tabulation purposes, that card puncher, who's called a card puncher, they are called a card puncher. The machine they use is also called a card puncher. So just to add to your nomenclature.
Nice.
And they're going to feed
punchers. I'm adding. I know any other fun terms and internal terminology, sort of deep terminology, we're here for. Okay, so keep it going.
When they later talk about mechanical tabulating machines, one person, at least who writes the employee manual, calls these robots as well too. So there are robots involved in the story.
So it reminds me a little bit of the calling the largely women, in fact, largely Black women, apparently at NASA, calculators, right? You know, like giving the human beings a term that now we think of as sort of actually a machine, that the person with the machine skill was a person. All right, keep going.
Yeah, I mean, the most common version of that actually was the typewriter. Before the typewriter was just a machine, or as just a machine, often it was also the person who was using a typewriter would be sometimes called a typewriter. So paper. We're back to paper. The magic of paper.
So people get to just write. It's not the drop down menu. So instead of saying, "Oh, I'm not exactly sure which category this is," like, well, how about this? So they write it down. They turn it in. At least we know they're not curbstoning.
So, I mean, one great place you can see this, if you look in the American Southwest in 1940, look in, say, Texas. In a number of places in Texas, we found this. One of my research assistants, I run a little history lab of Colgate undergraduates from our ivory tower, Colgate Tower.
You didn't like my Crest white strips, ivory tower.
I'm just gonna.
You gave me quite a scowl. Kind of. Well, you tried.
Yeah, no, I mean, we learned to live with certain jokes. So
hey, Colgate, I know it's a cheap shot. All right, go on.
So Andrea de la Hoyos, who was in my history lab, she spent a whole bunch of time trawling through Texas, Arizona, New Mexico census sheets. And one of the things she was looking for is what we knew, that in 1940, it was no longer an acceptable racial category to be Mexican as race. But in 1930, very briefly, Mexican had been added as a racial category. Now, the way in which it was removed is itself kind of fascinating. But essentially what happened is it was put there in part because of the interests of statisticians, and it doesn't appear to have been something that was particularly controversial for many people who, many Mexican Americans at the time. But after the Mexican racial category starts to take hold in the 1930s, people start to see the implications, which is happening, that being a race that isn't white in the Jim Crow South in the 1930s is a dangerous position to hold. And so the invention of the Mexican category in a whole variety of factors starts to be tied up with and related to the way in which Mexican Americans are being deported. I mean, this is a point in which there are mass, what are called deportations of American citizens of Mexican descent who are sent to Mexico during the Depression. So this racialization of Mexicanness is really dangerous in a whole variety of ways. And so both activists in the United States, Mexican American activists in the United States, and the Mexican government campaign with the State Department, get the State Department to say there cannot be a Mexican racial category in the 1940 census. And some of the statisticians didn't like this, because I can see the way I know somebody doesn't like something is if there's lots of memos telling people to do things. Right. And so the director of the census has to write a bunch of different memos saying, no, really, no Mexican race category. So there was some pushback. They do this thing, but then paper. So when an enumerator like I think it's Angie Robinson is this enumerator in Houston, maybe in Dallas, that we were looking at. She's wandering around, and she starts out, she's in a predominantly white neighborhood. She moves into a different neighborhood. She marks that she's moving into this new neighborhood, and starts to enumerate a whole bunch of African American individuals and families and households. And then she runs into some people who, whether they they might have said this. She might have judged this based on what she was looking, because enumerators were allowed to ascribe race. They could just look at a person and kind of decide what race was, or they could talk to people around them and decide, like, what race is this person? But she starts writing down a whole bunch of people as Mexican, MEX, in this racial category, which is not allowed, not in the form.
Not supposed to do that. Even the Mexican government doesn't want that. They want to be a nation.
Yeah. Yep. So this comes through. And so now what eventually then happens, and you can see this on this paper because of the fun paper, is that when these forms get all sent back to Washington, D.C., there's an editor whose job is to go through and cross out every one of those Mexican MEX labels and write a 1. And that 1 indicates the card puncher. They're going to hit a 1, and 1 means white. 1 is the code for white. So all of these people who were racialized as Mexican by this enumerator are now retransformed into the proper statistical category, according to the Census Bureau, of white, and will show up in the records as white. And none of this happened until now, when we like look back at these records and we start to see, like, so I mean, right, just to your point, like the communities and the enumerators are defining themselves in all kinds of interesting ways. And sometimes it might be the enumerator, sometimes it might be the community negotiating, sometimes they're fighting with one another. It's hard to say, but
so I don't want to screw this up. I want to be sensitive and not screw this up. But as I recall, I have filled out forms where there is a category that's something like white non-Hispanic, right? That it sort of connects, right? And I wonder if that was even a remnant, right, of a time. Was there, it sounds like there was a chance for meaningful undercounting of the Latino population around that time. So when we even think about the rise in Latino population, we might actually be overestimating the rise, right? Because we were undercounting previous, because they were crossing out MEX and putting in 1.
So, I mean, one way to understand, so what you encountered was, the norm for quite a while now has been that there's an ethnicity question, what it's called, an ethnicity question, which is Hispanic or not Hispanic, and then a race question.
Yep.
And those are there's debate at this present moment about precisely the best way to actually integrate those things together into possibly one question. But yeah, I mean, when I would tell the story sometimes to people who were advocates for counting the Latinx population, they would sometimes be like, "Oh, this is terrible," right? But the advocates of that moment, in the midst of the like horrors of Jim Crow, didn't want to be visible. One of the fascinating thing is the way in which, because of the successes of the civil rights movement, because of the way in which the people fought for voting rights, fought for civil rights, after the 1960s, suddenly visibility becomes a benefit. That looking accurate counts in the census of non-white populations becomes a means of ensuring that the Voting Rights Act can be properly adjudicated. It becomes a way of ensuring that people are properly counted and represented. But it takes essentially an instrument, the census, which for most of its history was pretty well constructed to enforce white supremacy, right? Remember, the census from the very beginning was also the mechanism by which the 3/5 compromise was put in place to make sure that African-American enslaved people only counted as 3/5 of a person. That entire, up until 1950, that's what it does. And then because of the civil rights movement, the census gets turned around and repurposed as a tool for trying to empower people who had previously been pushed to the margins.
I should have asked something like this very early on. And I don't want to use the word favorite because it might be decidedly, as you just mentioned, unfavorite. But if you were going to say the 3, you can pick a different number. If you're going to say the 3 most notable, or 3 of the most notable decisions or realities of American life that turned upon census results, right? Because I do think there's a lot of layers of the trying to unsheath, to try to uncover the sort of cloak of boringness. There are a bunch of layers to that. And some of it, I think, is just people kind of get scared of math, right? So once you say like, hey, come to the math party, it's like the second word doesn't matter anymore. It's like, well, I didn't hear the party part. I just heard the math part. I'm not coming to that thing. I don't remember what you called it. I don't remember what it was, but it was the math something or other. Okay. So if we're trying to, I think that's I think that's some of it. So getting to helping people understand, no, this is really important. This isn't just a math thing that you avoid. This is a thing to dig into. Give me three. You can pick whatever number is, but three is one possibility of things that really have mattered based on the census. We know about district drawing, right? We talk a lot about district drawing, right? For congressional districts, et cetera. But keep going.
Yeah, so that's one of the interesting things is that these days, because of the significance of the Voting Rights Act, like district drawing is the thing we're often like mostly focused on. But that's like one part of a much larger part of this this movement to translate census records, census counts into democratic governance. So like the very beginning of the question, of the answer to your question, is just to say the census is required in the Constitution. It's literally built into the Constitution as a necessary mechanism for this democratic experiment to possibly work. So like it's premised on the idea that like we're going to have this government. It's going to be based on allocating fairly representation from between the states according to how many people they have. So we need to know how many people they have, right? And therefore the census exists to make that kind of apportionment of power between the states possible, both in the House of Representatives and then in the Electoral College. So one answer to your question, one thing that I didn't know anything about until I wrote this book, and now I find frankly quite shocking, is that for most of the history of the United States, up until 1910, what would happen is the census would take place, they would count people, they would send those numbers to Congress. Congress would look at them and they'd have a series of debates and they'd say, all right, I think the size of the House should be this many seats. And then based on these proportions, this is how we'll allocate them amongst the states. And what frequently happened, what usually happened, was that the House would grow as the population grew. And indeed, it would often grow such that no or only one or two states lost any representatives. That would mean for that to happen, then states that are growing very quickly would gain a whole lot of seats. But then the ones that aren't growing so quickly, or that maybe even be shrinking, they just kind of hold steady. The result is, though, like there's more people in Congress, and at the same time, there's more people in the United States. So it kind of makes sense, right? They're in fact, even at that pace, the population of the United States was still growing faster than the size of Congress was growing. That begins to change in 1910. And then in 1910, it's set. In 1920, Congress says, we're going to stop this. We are going to pass a bill. We're going to just be at the same size that we were in 1910. It turns out the way that Congress is structured, with a whole bunch of senators who aren't particularly interested in seeing their states lose representatives, it was impossible to pass a bill to apportion the US House of Representatives. So the House was not apportioned at all the entire 1920s. So instead, the Congress creates essentially an insurance policy. They say, fine, if Congress fails to act, we're going to have this algorithm that's going to determine how it is we're going to apportion seats amongst Congress, and we're going to put that in place. And then when Congress fails to act, it'll work. 1930, Congress failed to pass a bill, and so that insurance policy kicked in. 1940, same thing happens, but this time the Democrats realized that the existing algorithm they're using to apportion it took a seat and gave it to Michigan, which is kind of Republican, that could, using a slightly different, perfectly reasonable algorithm, have gone to Arkansas, which is very Democratic. So the Democrats pass a new bill that says, let's use this other one, which is still the algorithm we now use all the time, giving that seat to Arkansas. And in the process, they removed the tiny window of time where Congress can act on its own, making the entire system entirely automatic. So now, the numbers of Congress comes through and it gets turned into an apportionment. You might think, all right, not a big deal, right? That seems like a very efficient use of things. What it means is that no one ever, I certainly never thought about it, we just are stuck at 435 seats. Congress has very little incentive to ever think about it, and Congress doesn't act unless it's Congress is forced to do things most of the time. And so we've seen since that time the population of the United States triple, while the size of the House remains the same.
Interesting. What? All right. So you get into the boring stuff and you find all kinds of stuff that isn't boring as long as you're willing to get into the detail. All right. I do want to get into one of your chapters. It's counting with friends. It's not really a chapter necessarily about counting with friends, but it is very much about counting with, let's say, friends with air quotation marks. And you look at the census count in Mississippi. Why did you look at Mississippi? What made that particularly interesting?
I mean, I let the story, the documents direct me in this one. So the director of the census, a guy named William Lane Austin, is from Mississippi. So he is a bureaucrat. He's a Democrat. The reason he's the director is because he's been a loyal Democrat for a long time, and he had done pretty well when Woodrow Wilson was president as well. But then in the middle, when Hoover came in, he kind of got sidelined and pushed to the side, right? So like even within the bureaucracy, you see how people's ties to the party are going to shape what their role is. And so Austin is interested in his own state, and he's interested in part because he's got allies there who he wants to work with. But the Roosevelt administration has its own interests and allies in Mississippi politics. And so that was a kind of one of the things that it got me interested. The other thing that about Mississippi, which happens to have a very influential congressperson, John E. Rankin. Rankin is probably most famous to people who are listening to this for one of two reasons. One, because he was a chief sponsor of the GI Bill, and two, because he was just one of the most virulent white supremacists in Congress, and said a lot of really terrible things about a lot of people. And so, but the other thing that he did, which is less notable to people, is that he spent a lot of time on the Census Committee. And so he wasn't, he really liked to use his power. So in fact, he made it so that any Census Bureau official who wanted to make sure they got the kind of census bill they wanted was going to have to make sure he was happy. And so I was able to get access to his records at the University of Mississippi, and they're gigantic folders full of all this correspondence of him with Census Bureau officials, but then also him running and talking with the people who are running the process of getting all those enumerators, selecting them, and then sending them out. So it gives me a chance to see how what was happening under the hood, what was actually happening in choosing these enumerators.
Interesting. So how did you talk about Congressman John Rankin, who represented the Northeastern District on the border with Alabama and Tennessee? You served on that Congressional Census Committee, helped protect political power in Mississippi. Say more about some of the ways that census appointments could be used to, encourage counting with friends, and how that form of political patronage. Say more about how that could leverage power.
Yeah, I mean, so we often think of good statistics or good numbers as being somehow devoid of politics. But the thing that becomes really clear when you spend some time here is that sure, there are some ways in which partisan politics can make numbers worse. At the same time, you don't get census numbers without partisan politics, in the sense that the partisan system and the political system actually organized the way that this whole counting system worked. So Congress had it set up such that when it came time to find those and select those 120,000 people, the party that was in power largely dictated that selection process. So each congressperson from in this case, the Democratic Party, each senator amongst the Democrats got to then choose a district supervisor for their district. And then if there were any Republican congresspeople, the senators in that state got to divvy up amongst themselves those districts for themselves. And they would pick these district supervisors whose job was to then go through and find people. And what becomes clear as we look at Rankin, for instance, writing to his district supervisor, trying to give instructions, is he frequently says to him, look, we need people who are going to do a good job, but if you can find a way to hire our friends, that would be good. And there's constant friends. And the district supervisor writes back and says, was thinking about hiring this guy. What do you think about it? He's a pretty good friend of ours. Or is this a good person? And Rankin would say, why don't you talk to him? He's a really good friend of mine, and he can tell you who are our friends in this. And what it means, right? These are people who have been politically loyal.
Yeah.
And these jobs, particularly in the midst of the Depression, are like a really good gig. It's a stable gig. It's not as good as maybe a long-term government gig, which Rankin is also trying to get people to take. In fact, like a few of the people he's trying to hire then quit those jobs because they get a better job working for the government through Rankin. But these are like, this is a lifeline. And many of the letters we see are from, there's quite a number coming from widows with children who write to Rankin, explain both often how much they appreciate his politics. And by that, especially, they talk about things like his support for the Tennessee Valley Authority. They really like the way in which he's bringing electricity to the area. They think of him as a progressive politician in that way. They write about this, and then they say, look, I need to support my children, or a brother says, we need to support my sister. Can you do anything for us? Like, we just need one of these enumerator positions. And if they do this they beg properly, they get his attention, and that gets sent off to this district supervisor with saying like, maybe make this person our friend.
So you do talk about the William Lane Austin and the David Niles, right? Where Austin's a Democrat, David Niles is in the Commerce Department. He thought Austin was old fashioned, believed a New Deal Democrat should oversee the census counting. Any more about how that the schism between the Democratic Party dominated American congressional politics and politics in general because of this sort of uneasy alliance betwixt the Southern conservatives and sort of the New Dealers? Any more about how that schism resolved itself, or how it shaped the 1940 census?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to dig in here. One way that we could see it, you could show it in a whole bunch of different ways, but one of the ways it surfaced was precisely because Austin wrote to Niles, and Niles was essentially the person who was in charge, working under Harry Hopkins in the Commerce Department, of like overseeing how good jobs were going to be apportioned throughout the whole apparatus. So like, if you think of the political system as one in which there's there's a way of making policy, but then there's also massive patronage systems. The primary Democratic patronage person was James Farley, and he worked for the Democratic Party. But then under Roosevelt's administration, Hopkins was for a long time in charge of the Works Progress Administration. By all accounts, people loved Harry Hopkins, and Harry Hopkins loved giving people jobs. Just loved giving people jobs. And so he moves into commerce, in part because he's trying to like position himself possibly to become president. And Roosevelt thinks this is a way in which he can get on the good side of business. From commerce, he's in charge of the census. Niles is his representative. And they are figuring out how to make sure that then all of these census patronage jobs are allocated in a way that's going to best help the Roosevelt administration. When Austin gets into this system, I think particularly when he's thinking about Mississippi, which he knows well, he says, I want to take care of handing out these two new positions called area managers. They're not that big a deal. They don't actually even do a whole lot, but they're two patronage positions. And he wants to give them to, or actually it's just one at that point. He wants to give that one position to the senior senator from Mississippi, who is his ally. Unfortunately, that guy, what's that? His friend, exactly. An old friend, a really old friend. And Niles says, oh no, we can't do that, because that guy was once an FDR Democrat, but has increasingly come to think that FDR is a little bit too much of a liberal. And instead, Theodore Bilbo, who is the junior senator from Mississippi, is understood to be a much more committed New Dealer. He is also a very desperate racist, and but he's a good progressive. And so as a result, Roosevelt and Niles are committed to making sure that he gets the chance to name this area manager and all of the kind of money that goes along with setting that up. And so they kind of get at loggerheads, and you see in the correspondence between them, kind of working this out. There's a great moment in which Niles is writing back and forth with the president, the president's right hand man, Paul Watson, I think, and they're like, so we've been telling everyone these area manager positions are completely non-political, and they're not, but the president and I went over every single name to make sure that each one of them was acceptable to him. So the president sees and understands that each one of these patronage opportunities is a way to exert executive authority over and put in positions of power and build friendships with people that have been supporting his policies. So even though the Democratic Party is this big tent operation that has old school Southern conservatives, New Deal, new liberals, what Roosevelt is attempting to do through the census and a whole variety of other ways is turn this into a much more consistently liberal party, one that supports the New Deal and his kind of operations.
All right, before we wrap, so I asked, sort of three, understand at least three ways where the census really matters. I already jotted down three of those, right? One is redistricting. You also mentioned an element of our sort of shameful racial track record, counting for and accounting for the 3/5 compromise. Then you told the story of not only that, but the number of members of Congress entirely has its roots in the census. Any other, including modern illustrations or examples of why the census matters? And you can enumerate or you can story tell, either one. Any other ways? If we don't start with why, at least we can finish with why this matters.
So, I mean, the thing that you hear most frequently from census advocates when they're trying to get people to cooperate with the census. Also, I will note too that the official slogan for the 1940 census was "cooperate." I mean, it's perfect for today. It's exactly the kind of thing people want to be told.
Then you might have actually then said, that was before maybe even inspired certain books about 44 years later, right? Like the idea of something that says cooperate, it sounded very much not like cooperate, but do what you're told. But at the time, maybe it sounded cool. It was a little friendlier. It didn't have the same meaning.
I don't know. But so when you cooperate, and when we do want people to cooperate with census, right? And
yes, cooperate.
The most frequent way in which we get people to do that is that census advocates say, look, do you like your library? Do you like your fire department? Do you think your hospital deserves funding? You need to be counted, because especially since the 1970s, increasingly, a lot of ways in which Congress allocates funding to states and communities is through essentially a direct mechanical relationship to these numbers. The numbers that are produced by the census are used to essentially dictate how it is that all kinds of different flows of funds, trillions of dollars worth of funding, are allocated throughout Congress. So apart from any of the other kind of ways to think about power, just a ton of money is dictated by the census. I mean, the thing I'd add to that is it's not just about money. It's not just about political power. The thing about the census, and this is something to reiterate right now, at least based on my political values here, but the thing about the census always has been that it counts every person. This is in the Constitution originally. It's in the 14th Amendment, when the 14th Amendment then abolishes slavery, but again indicates that persons should be enumerated. There have been occasionally fights trying to change that to be only citizens, for instance, should be enumerated, or to otherwise narrow the number of people who ought to be counted, but it's fully persons. And one of the reasons I wrote about this book about the census is because everybody's in it. And so the census is one of the only places in which a record of every single person in the United States every person is counted, and then a record of them is kept for hundreds of years in the future, right? And you might be on Twitter or Facebook or any number of these places. Those records are not going to survive 70 years. I can't say. Who knows? How do I know that? I don't know that. I don't think they're going to survive. These records might. They probably will. We can tell these stories about people 72 years ago precisely because the government cared enough to count them. And so the census assures a place for every single person, regardless of how powerful they are or how much power they lack, as long as they're counted. They show up here. And that's an argument there for supporting the census. It's also an argument for doing everything we can to make sure that every person is counted, because there are persistent undercounts, and those are a shame on us as a nation.
So it reminds me of going to space, right? You go to space to find a new mineral, or you go to space because it's there, because we want to see space, because that's part of the exploration of life. So you're saying, no, it's not merely utilitarian. It's not merely so you can get another fire department or even get another congressional seat. It is because we are here. And this is the record that we were in fact here. And here is who we were.
Amen.
So cooperate. Squad
Cooperate.
leaders will monitor the enumerators to spot, check potential curbstoners. I want to say thank you so much to Dan Bouk. There's so much more we could talk about. The book is, I'll hold it up again, Democracy's Data, Hidden Stories in the U.S. Senate and How to Read Them. It is one of New York Times' notable books. Strongly encourage people checking it out, engaging with his work. Thank you so much for unveiling boringness, which of course is not. Plug again your website.
You can find me at shroudedincloaksofboringness.com. Thanks.
Dan Bouk, thank you so much, man.
Take care.